There is a version of the world where Pokemon never existed, where a small development company called Game Freak quietly shuttered its doors in the mid 1990s, where a man named Satoshi Tajiri never got to share his childhood with the rest of the planet, and where billions of people never felt the specific electric thrill of seeing a tiny monster they had spent hours searching for suddenly appear in the tall grass. That world is genuinely hard to imagine now because Pokemon is so deeply woven into the fabric of modern culture that pulling it out would leave a hole the shape of an entire childhood. But the version of Pokemon that exists, the one you grew up with, the one that still lives somewhere warm in the back of your memory, is riddled with secrets, hidden things, facts that were never meant to be found, stories that got buried under decades of official marketing and a pristine nostalgia, developer confessions that only came out years later in quiet interviews, glitches that should never have existed, scrapped designs that haunt the files like ghosts nobody bothered to delete. This is a quiet journey through all of it, a long, slow, relaxed walk through everything that was hiding just beneath the surface of the most successful media franchise on the planet. So, wherever you are right now, in bed, on the couch, headphones in, lights low, settle in. This one is going to take a while, and that is exactly the point. Part 1: The Bug Collector's Dream. How Pokemon Almost Didn't Happen. Satoshi Tajiri grew up in Machida, a suburb on the western edge of Tokyo. When he was a child in the 1960s and 1970s, Machida still had the texture of a rural town. Rice paddies at the edges, ponds and streams threading through the neighborhoods, forests close enough to walk to after school. And Tajiri walked to them constantly. He would spend his afternoons hunting beetles in the undergrowth, dredging ponds for aquatic insects, studying the way dragonflies moved over still water. He cataloged what he found. He traded specimens with other kids in the neighborhood. He became so well known for this particular obsession that his classmates gave him a nickname: Dr. Bug. He wanted to become an entomologist when he grew up. He wanted to spend his life studying insects, the way other kids wanted to become astronauts or soccer players. But the city kept expanding. Year by year, the paddies disappeared under concrete. The forests shrank. The ponds were drained and paved. By the time Tajiri was a teenager, most of the places where he had caught his insects were gone, replaced by apartment buildings and convenience stores. The world he had loved as a small boy had been quietly erased. He pivoted to video games, not out of passion for them at first, but almost out of desperation. The way someone who loves nature might turn to documentaries when the wilderness itself is no longer accessible. He started haunting Tokyo's arcades, feeding coins into Space Invaders and Pac-Man, developing the kind of obsessive fluency with game systems that only someone who had already spent years obsessively cataloging beetles could develop. He noticed bugs in the games, design flaws, hidden exploits, and he started writing about them. In 1981, when Tajiri was 16 years old, he launched a hand-stapled gaming magazine he called Game Freak. He wrote it himself, photocopied it, and distributed it to arcades and gaming shops. It was thin and rough and completely earnest, filled with tips and analysis and his own observations about game design. One of the people who noticed it was a young illustrator named Ken Sugimori, who began contributing artwork. The two became close friends, and Game Freak grew, slowly, modestly, reaching a peak readership of around 10,000 people at its height, which is genuinely remarkable for a handmade zine. Over the course of the 1980s, Tajiri and Sugimori began teaching themselves to actually make games instead of just writing about them. They pitched ideas to publishers. They studied programming. Game Freak the magazine gradually transformed into Game Freak the development studio, officially incorporating as a company in 1989. Their first game, a puzzle platformer called Mendel Palace, known in Japan as Quinty, was published by Namco on the Famicom in 1989. It was decent enough to establish their credentials. Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario and Zelda, took notice of the team and became something of an informal mentor to Tajiri. This relationship would matter more than either of them probably knew at the time. The actual moment that Pokemon was born is something Tajiri has described in several interviews over the years, and it is one of those origin stories that sounds almost too perfect to be true. In the early 1990s, he saw two children sitting together, each holding a Game Boy, connected by the thin gray link cable that Nintendo had introduced to allow multiplayer gaming. He watched them for a moment and imagined something impossible and specific. Insects crawling along the cable between the two machines. Creatures traveling from one world to another through that thin wire. The image connected directly to his childhood, to the beetles and the dragonflies and the trading and the cataloging. He could build a game where players caught creatures and shared them with their friends, where the act of collection was also the act of connection, where you could have something rare and offer it to someone else as a gift or a challenge. He pitched the concept to Nintendo, except the staff there did not fully understand it. The idea of a game where the entire point was to collect, trade, and battle small monsters was genuinely foreign to the late 1980s game industry. But Nintendo trusted Tajiri's track record and Miyamoto was in his corner, so they agreed to explore the project. What followed was 6 years of development that nearly broke everyone involved. 6 years. Game Freak was a tiny company. At its peak during development, barely a couple dozen people. The budget was thin, then thinner, then nearly non-existent. There were months where employees went unpaid. 5 people quit. Tajiri himself stopped taking a salary and relied on his father's income to survive. The game nearly died a dozen times. It was saved in the final stages by an investment from Creatures Inc., a company founded by former Nintendo staff who provided enough capital to complete development in exchange for a one-third share of the franchise rights. That one-third share would one day be worth billions of dollars. The game that emerged from those 6 years was Pocket Monsters Red and Green, released in Japan in February 1996. The Game Boy was already considered outdated hardware by that point. Nintendo's 16-bit Super Famicom had been out for years, and the console market was charging ahead. But the Game Boy was cheap, and younger children could afford it when they couldn't afford console games. Red and Green sold 10 million copies in Japan within the year. There is a detail that Tajiri mentioned in a later interview that almost nobody discusses, and it is one of those quiet facts that reframes the whole thing. He named the main character of the games Satoshi, his own first name. He named the protagonist's rival Shigeru, after Shigeru Miyamoto, his mentor. When the games were localized for Western audiences, Satoshi became Ash Ketchum and Shigeru became Gary Oak. But every time you watch Ash walk toward his rival in the original anime, you are watching Tajiri's tribute to the person who helped him survive those 6 desperate years. It is right there in plain sight. Almost nobody knows it. Tajiri had also made one deliberate decision during development that reflected a specific moral philosophy he held about games and about children. In Pocket Monsters Red and Green, when your Pokemon lose a battle, they do not die. They faint. They lose consciousness and need to be healed, but they come back. Tajiri has said in interviews that this was intentional. He believed it was important for children to understand that losing was not the same as permanent destruction. The consequence of failure should be recoverable. You go to the Pokemon Center and you try again. That single design choice, so small it barely registers as a decision, is built into every single Pokemon game ever made, all the way up to the present day. The franchise's gentleness toward failure is not accidental. It is a philosophy that a man who watched his childhood habitat disappear decided to pass forward to everyone who would ever pick up a Game Boy. The Safari Zone, introduced in the original Kanto games, was also a direct expression of Tajiri's childhood. The zone works differently from normal battles. Instead of fighting wild Pokemon, you throw bait or rocks to manipulate their behavior, and you use special Safari balls to try to catch them. The chaotic, unpredictable mechanics of the area were designed to feel like what Tajiri remembered from his insect-catching days. The specific uncertainty of approaching something in the wild, the way a creature might flee or stay or turn towards you, depending on 100 variables you could not control. He wanted players to feel the difference between a battle and a hunt, between conquest and observation. He mostly succeeded. The Safari Zone is still one of the strangest and most distinctly atmospheric locations in any Pokemon game. And the warden who guards it, the old man who loses his teeth and needs you to help him recover them, is, in his own odd way, a figure in the lineage of Dr. Bug himself, someone who dedicated his life to watching rare creatures in a carefully preserved space, unwilling to let the encroachment of the outside world take that from him. There is one more founding detail worth sitting with. When the games were being prepared for international release, the name Pocket Monsters ran into trademark problems in certain markets. The name was shortened and restructured. Pocket Monsters became Pokemon. That compression, taking something full and specific and making it into a syllable that could belong to any language, turned out to be one of the great accidental acts of branding in entertainment history. The word Pokemon sounds equally native in Japanese, English, French, Portuguese, and Korean. It belongs nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Tajiri did not intend for this to be a strength. It just happened to be one. That is the nature of a lot of what built Pokemon. Things that just happened to be strengths. Accidents that became foundations. Bugs that became features. Secrets that became legends. If you are watching this right now and you want to tell me where in the world you are, drop it in the comments. I love knowing where these videos find people. And if you have not subscribed yet, there is a button right below this video that would make a real difference to the channel. Now let's keep going. Part 2. The secret at the bottom of the cartridge. How Mew changed everything. The cartridge for Pokemon Red and Green was full. Not almost full, completely, entirely, totally full. Game Freak had crammed every single thing they intended to include into the limited memory of a Game Boy cartridge. And by the time development was wrapping up, there was no room left for anything. The programmers had been explicitly instructed by Nintendo that once the debugging process was finished, the final stage of development where you remove all the test code used to find and fix errors, nobody was to touch the code again. Altering code at that stage, that close to release, risked introducing new errors that could corrupt the game entirely. With the release date bearing down on them, a mistake at that point would have been catastrophic. Shigeki Morimoto did not follow the instruction. Morimoto was a programmer on the original games, and he is now a senior figure at Game Freak, having directed several entries in the series and designed the battle systems for others. In 1996, he was a young programmer who had been working on Pocket Monsters Red and Green for years. When the debugging tools were removed from the cartridge near the end of development, he noticed something. The removal had freed up exactly 300 bytes of space. 300 bytes. To put that in context, that is roughly equivalent to 4 lines of typed text. It was almost nothing. It was technically enough. Morimoto had been quietly working on a new Pokemon design. He kept it to himself. Most of the rest of the team, including director Satoshi Tajiri, had not been told. He had designed a small cat-like creature with an oversized head and a long, slender tail. A creature that felt fundamentally different from the rest of the Pokemon in the game. Not ferocious, not imposing, not typed into any obvious elemental category, just present and somehow ancient and gentle. He named it Mew, and in those final weeks before release, he used those 300 bytes to squeeze it into the cartridge. The original story that circulated for years was that this was purely Morimoto's prank, a secret kept from everyone, Nintendo included. The full truth is somewhat more nuanced. Tajiri was, according to later accounts, quietly aware of what Morimoto had done and approved it. But Morimoto genuinely had not had time to get Ken Sugimori, the franchise's lead artist, to design Mew properly. The game was too close to shipping, so Morimoto designed Mew himself, rushed in the final days before Goldmaster, which is why Mew's original sprite was so small and uncolored compared to the other Pokemon. There simply was no time for anything more elaborate. The intention was that Mew would be a secret known only to Game Freak's staff. Something they could look at and smile privately at while the rest of the world played the game without any idea it was there. The only people meant to ever have a Mew were the developers themselves. Then a bug appeared. Not a Pokemon, a programming bug. A glitch in the game's memory handling. In Pokemon Red and Green, the game stores certain data about trainer encounters in a specific memory address. Specifically, when a trainer spots you and initiates a battle, the game saves encounter information there. Under very precise circumstances, using a move like Fly or Teleport to escape a trainer's line of sight after they have already spotted you, then triggering a wild encounter in the right location, the game loads that stored encounter data incorrectly. The result is that it reads the memory values in a way that can produce a wild Mew encounter. Word spread among children in Japan. Players who had never heard the name Mew before were suddenly encountering a pink, round, unmistakably different creature in certain spots and certain routes. Nobody at Game Freak had planned for this. Morimoto later said in a translated interview posted by his company that they essentially had to decide quickly whether to address the bug or use it. They chose to use it. In April 1996, just 2 months after the game's Japanese release, the manga magazine CoroCoro ran a contest. The announcement was simple. Send a postcard, enter a draw, and if you were selected, you would receive the mysterious 151st Pokemon that players had been whispering about. The response was staggering. Approximately 78,000 children entered the contest. Only 20 were selected. Those 20 children had to mail their actual Game Boy cartridges, their physical game cartridges, to Game Freak's offices. Morimoto then sat at his personal computer, generated a Mew for each cartridge using a GameLink cable, trading it onto each one individually. Each Mew was unique, coded with its own original trainer ID. Then the cartridges were mailed back to their owners. This distribution, modest as it sounds, was the first official Pokemon event in the franchise's history. The first time a rare creature was distributed outside of normal gameplay to a select group of players. The template that would eventually become the infrastructure of worldwide event distributions, mystery gifts, Wi-Fi events, and online codes was built from a programmer at a desk with a cable and a stack of cartridges. Whether any of those 20 original Mews still exist on working cartridges is genuinely unknown. The original Game Boy cartridges stored their save data using a small internal battery, and those batteries degrade over time. An old cartridge sitting in a drawer for 30 years may no longer have any saved data at all. The 20 most exclusive Pokemon ever distributed might have simply faded away as the batteries died one by one over the decades. Or one of them might still be alive on some dusty cartridge in a closet in Japan, its original trainer ID and everything, waiting for someone who knows what they have. The existence of Mew did something important for the franchise's early momentum in Japan. Tajiri once said, in a quote that has been translated and shared many times, "There were 150 characters in the game, and Mew was number 151. It created a myth about the game that there was an invisible character out there. It kept the interest alive." He was right. The mystery of Mew, the playground rumors about how to find it, the competing theories about secret areas and hidden triggers, and whether the truck in Vermilion City's harbor concealed something important. All of it kept children talking about and playing Pokemon months after they would otherwise have moved on. The truck. That truck deserves its own moment. Near Vermilion City's harbor, on an area of dock that can only be reached by surfing past the SS, and once it has left the port, there is a truck. Just a truck. Parked on a small, inaccessible dock. It serves no function in the game. You cannot interact with it in any meaningful way. Tajiri and the development team put it there purely as a piece of environmental detail, a bit of world-building texture to make the harbor feel like a real place where vehicles move goods. But because Mew was such a persistent mystery, because players knew something was hidden in the game and were desperately looking for it, the truck became the center of one of the most enduring hoaxes in gaming history. The rumor, spread on playgrounds, in schoolyards, passed hand-to-hand in notes, and whispered over link cables, was that if you used the move strength to push the truck aside, you would find Mew underneath it. The steps varied depending on who was telling the story. Some said you had to keep the SS Anne from leaving by using strength before you got the HM. Some said you needed a specific combination of items. Some said you had to have all 150 Pokemon caught first. None of it was true. The truck was just a truck. Mew was in the game, but not under there. In Pokemon Sun and Moon, released 2 decades after the original games, Game Freak placed a parked truck near the harbor in Hau'oli City. It serves no purpose. It is simply there, a quiet nod from the developers to the generation of children who once spent hours trying to figure out what was hiding under the one in Vermilion. It is Game Freak acknowledging the myth with a smile. A gift to the people who were there at the beginning. There is a version of the Mew story where everything goes slightly differently, and Pokemon does not become Pokemon. In that version, Morimoto follows the instruction and leaves the code untouched. There is no 151st Pokemon. There is no playground mystery. There is no Koro Koro contest, no 78,000 entries, no first event. Without that sustained curiosity, without children still arguing and wondering and playing months after release, the momentum might have dissipated before the franchise found its global footing. Morimoto broke a rule. He took a risk that could have corrupted the entire game at the worst possible moment. And that risk became the heartbeat of everything that followed. Part 2B. The truck, the glitch, and the first event in Pokemon history. Continued. The story of how Mew was distributed in those early months deserves more than a paragraph because the mechanics of it are genuinely extraordinary by today's standards. In 2025, when a developer wants to distribute a rare piece of content to millions of players simultaneously, they flip a server flag and update a database. The entire global player base receives the item within minutes. It is frictionless, instantaneous, essentially free to execute. In April 1996, Shigeki Morimoto personally generated each Mew, one at a time. Using his own computer and a GameLink cable, he connected each winning child's cartridge to his machine and traded the Mew across manually. He did this for 20 children in the first distribution, then for 100 in a second wave. A larger distribution later happened at the World Hobby Fair in Japan, where children could bring their cartridges to an event and receive the transfer. But even then, even at a physical event with infrastructure, The process was fundamentally the same: a person with a cable, a cartridge, and a Pokemon to share. Each Mew that Morimoto generated was unique, not in the way that a mass distribution would be uniform, but genuinely individually coded, each one bearing its own original trainer values and trainer ID numbers. Every one of those early Mews was a different object. Some of the 20 children who received theirs in that first wave, who mailed their cartridges to Game Freak's offices and got them back with a mysterious pink creature they had never encountered before, may not have fully understood what they held. They probably put the cartridge back in their Game Boy and used Mew in battles against their friends. They probably did not know they had the most exclusive Pokemon in history. The question of whether any of those original 20 Mews still exist is one of the small mysteries that the Pokemon fandom returns to periodically. The Game Boy cartridge stores its save data in an onboard battery. That battery has a finite lifespan, somewhere between 15 and 30 years, depending on the specific cartridge and how it was stored. An original Game Boy cartridge from 1996, sitting in a closet or a box somewhere, may well have lost its save data entirely. The Mew would be gone, not deleted exactly, just unreachable, the same way a name carved on a rock eventually weathers away, or the battery might still have charge. Somewhere in Japan, there may be a cartridge that still holds one of those first 20 Mews waiting in a save file for a Game Boy that may or may not still turn on. Morimoto himself has spoken about the moment he first saw Mew in the finished anime film. The first Pokemon movie featured Mew as a central presence, pink, floating, with those enormous blue eyes, moving with a personality and physicality that the game's tiny sprite had never been able to suggest. Morimoto said he was astonished. He had designed Mew in the final days of development, rushed, working from his own imagination without Sugimori's input. He had never seen what Mew would look like moving, expressing itself, existing as a creature rather than a handful of pixels. The animators had built a character from almost nothing, from that small sprite and some rough concept notes, and produced something that felt alive. He described watching the film as the first time he truly saw what Mew was. The name itself has a specific resonance in Japanese. Mew is spelled in Japanese as Mew, which carries a soft, ambiguous quality. It sounds like a name a child would invent for a mysterious animal. The creature's design, with its oversized fetal head, its long curling tail, its translucent skin, is deliberately primal in its shape. Tajiri had said he wanted a Pokemon that existed but did not appear, something that was present in the world without being visible. Mew's design fulfills that intention. It looks like something that was there before everything else, that retreated from the world as the world grew louder, that can only be found in the quiet corners of the code. The mythology built around Mew in the games, the journal entries in the ruined mansion on Cinnabar Island that describe the experiments that created Mewtwo from Mew's genetic material, the implication that Mew is the ancestor of all Pokemon, the one from which every type and every ability derived, was not fully planned from the beginning. It was assembled over time, retroactively, as the franchise grew and the writers built out the world's mythology. But it fits. It fits so naturally that it is hard to separate what was intended from what accumulated around the original design. The legend grew to match the creature that Morimoto quietly inserted into 300 bytes of space on a Game Boy cartridge in the winter of 1995. Part 3: Glitches, Ghosts, and the Strange Archaeology of Generation 1. The original Pokemon games are essentially archaeological sites at this point. Decades of players, programmers, and data miners have sifted through every corner of the code, and what they have found is a picture of development under pressure, a team rushing to get something finished, leaving placeholders in the walls and scaffolding still standing in the corners. Some of these leftover structures are harmless. Some are fascinating. A few of them broke reality in ways that Game Freak could not have predicted. Missing Number is the most famous of all of them. Most players who grew up with the original games encountered it at some point, or knew someone who had a strange, corrupted sprite that appeared where a Pokemon should not have been. That duplicated items, when you picked up the sixth slot in your bag, that could be caught and added to your party, and that behaved in deeply weird ways once you had it. For years, it was understood as a glitch, a mistake, a rogue element in the code. The actual story is more deliberate and more interesting than that. When Game Freak built the Pokédex system for Red and Green, they needed the game to be able to handle references to Pokemon numbers that did not correspond to any actual creature. The system reads Pokemon data from indexed memory slots, and if it is ever asked to read from a slot that does not contain a complete Pokemon, either because the slot is empty or because the data has been corrupted, the game could crash. To prevent this, the developers filled the empty slots with placeholder data. Not real Pokemon. Just enough structured information to prevent a crash if the system read those addresses. Missing Number is what happens when the game renders that placeholder data as an encounter. It has a sprite, a scrambled L shape made of corrupted pixel data, because the game is doing its best to display something using incomplete information. It has a cry. It even has stat data, although the stats are bizarre and inconsistent. The developers never intended for players to find missing no. It was utility code, the equivalent of a blank tile in a mosaic. There to prevent gaps from causing collapses, not to be examined itself. When they hit it, they placed it in a location that should have been inaccessible under normal gameplay. But the trainer fly glitch, using a move like fly or teleport to escape a trainer encounter in specific circumstances, then surfing along Cinnabar Island's eastern coast, bypassed those protections. And Missing Number became the most famous non-existent creature in video game history. What most people do not know is that Missing Number is not alone. The same memory space that produces Missing Number under certain conditions also contains dozens of other glitch entities, each with their own properties. Some of them are entirely harmless. Some are genuinely dangerous to your save file. There is a glitch creature called M Prime, rendered in the game as a corrupted apostrophe shape, that can cause save file corruption significant enough to make your game unplayable. Players who went looking for rare glitches sometimes found their entire progress erased. The Cinnabar Island coast was less a stretch of shoreline and more a minefield of things Game Freak had tried to hide. There is another glitch in the original games that went completely unnoticed for years, and represents one of the longest-running unintentional errors in franchise history. The move Focus Energy was designed to double the chance of landing a critical hit, a reliable boosting mechanic that should have made it genuinely useful in competitive play. Instead, due to a coding error in the critical hit calculation, Focus Energy actually reduced the chance of landing a critical hit. Using it made your Pokemon hit critically less often, not more. The move did the opposite of what it was supposed to do. This was not corrected until the third generation of games, meaning that for Pokemon Red, Blue, Yellow, Gold, Silver, and Crystal, across years and millions of copies sold, players who use Focus Energy were actively making their Pokemon perform worse and had no idea. The competitive players who figured this out empirically, through testing and observation, simply stopped using the move. The reason why it felt wrong took much longer to emerge. Glitch City is another one of those consequences of code that should not have been reached. In the Safari Zone, the game is designed to track your steps and boot you out when you have used up your allotment. But there is a specific sequence involving saving and resetting at just the right moment after entering and then exiting the Safari Zone that can confuse the game's memory about whether you're in the zone or not. If you walk around enough tiles after performing this reset sequence and then try to fly somewhere, the game sometimes loads a corrupted version of the destination map. Tiles appear in the wrong order. Walls and floors are randomized. You can walk through solid objects. The visual landscape becomes an abstract collage of game assets placed with no regard for logic or architecture. Players who discovered this in the 1990s did not have the tools to understand what they were looking at. They treated it like exploring a hidden level, a bonus world that Game Freak had secretly built into the game for those clever enough to find the entrance. In reality, they were walking through the aftermath of a collision between two memory states. The game attempting to load a location it did not recognize using whatever texture data happened to be nearby. It looked like a secret. It was actually a crash that had not quite finished crashing. Perhaps the most quietly strange hidden element of the original games involves the default names stored in the game's debug code. In the character naming system for the player, character, and the rival, the game assigns hidden default values that are not displayed during normal play. These are the names used internally in memory before the player enters a custom name. In the Japanese versions of Red and Green, these defaults are simply placeholder names. But in the international versions, someone, almost certainly a developer with a dry sense of humor, assigned the hidden values Nintendo and Sony to the player and the rival, respectively. In the mid-1990s, Nintendo and Sony were in the middle of an intensely competitive console war. The implication that the rival, the antagonist, the character who exists to be defeated, had been given the name of Nintendo's chief competitor was a quiet act of corporate rivalry humor, embedded in code that almost nobody would ever see. It was discovered by hackers years after the game's release. It is not visible under any circumstances during normal gameplay. It is just there in the code, like a note passed between developers that somehow made it into the finished product. There is also the matter of Professor Oak. Deep in the game's code for the original Red and Blue, there exists a complete functional trainer battle with Professor Oak. He has a full team of Pokemon. Not Pokemon that make sense for a researcher, but a strong, competitive team, including a level 66 Tauros, a level 67 Exeggutor, a level 68 Arcanine, a level 70 Gyarados, and a level 72 Charizard. The battle is coded to a very high standard. Trigger conditions were apparently set up for it at some point in development. But the battle is unreachable in the finished game. There is no event that triggers it. No path leads there. Game Freak built a fully realized final boss that nobody would ever fight, placed it in the code, and then sealed it off. The theories about why this exists vary. Some believe Oak was originally intended as an optional post-game challenge, a reward for very skilled players who had already beaten the Elite Four and Champion. Some believe it was a testing tool used during development. The most poetic interpretation, which is almost certainly not accurate but is worth sitting with anyway, is that Oak was always there as a secret the game kept about its own world. A reminder that the gentle professor who handed you your first Pokemon was once, in some version of his past, as good at this as anyone who ever held a team. Part 4. The anime's untold stories, banned, buried, and just barely made it through. The Pokemon anime has now been running for nearly 3 decades. Across that span, it has broadcast thousands of episodes in dozens of languages, telling the continuing story of a boy and his Pikachu working their way through an apparently infinite supply of new regions. What the official broadcast history does not tell you is how many episodes were quietly removed from rotation, how many never aired at all, and how many of the ones that did make it through were significantly altered before reaching their intended audiences. The most catastrophic event in the anime's history happened on December 16th, 1997. Episode 38 of the original series, titled Electric Soldier Porygon in Japanese, aired in Japan at 6:30 in the evening, to an estimated audience of several million children. Approximately 20 minutes into the episode, there's a sequence in which Pikachu uses his electric attack on a set of incoming missiles inside a computer world. The explosion that follows was animated using a technique called Paka Paka, rapidly alternating flashing lights in red and blue, creating a strobe effect. The sequence lasted several seconds. Approximately 685 children were admitted to hospitals that night with symptoms of epilepsy, seizures, vomiting, dizziness, and in some cases, loss of consciousness. The incident was reported on the news the following morning, which caused additional children who had been watching to develop anxiety-induced psychosomatic symptoms, and the total number of affected children rose further over the following days. Nintendo's stock price fell by 12,200 yen the next day. The show was pulled from broadcast immediately and went on a 4-month hiatus. The incident became known in Japan as Pokemon Shock. It changed animation practices globally. The regulations around flashing imagery in children's television were significantly tightened across multiple countries as a direct result of what happened that December evening. Every animated program that uses flashing effects now carries warning labels that trace their lineage, at least in part, back to a single Pokemon episode. Here is the detail that most people do not know, even now. Pikachu caused the seizures, not Porygon. The flashing lights that triggered the episode's response were produced by Pikachu's electric attack, not by anything Porygon did. Porygon and its evolved forms, Porygon 2 and Porygon Z, have not had a significant anime appearance in the decades since the episode aired. They have been essentially exiled from the animated medium because of an animation accident that Porygon had no part in causing. The entire Porygon evolutionary line became the scapegoat for an incident it did not create, and has been quietly sidelined ever since. Porygon Z has appeared in a single cameo in a movie opening sequence since 1997. That is its entire animated career following the incident. The Legend of Dratini is an episode that Western fans have, for the most part, never seen. It was banned from international broadcast before localization could even begin, and it was never dubbed into English. The episode itself is not particularly extraordinary in terms of story. It involves Ash arriving at the Safari Zone and meeting the Warden, a gruff man named Kaiser. The reason for the ban was that the episode contained an unusually high number of scenes featuring firearms. Trainers pointed guns at Ash and his companions. Kaiser himself pointed a gun at Ash in an early scene. By the content standards applied to children's programming in Western markets, this was simply not airable. But the episode contained something that Western fans lost access to as a result. At one point during the episode, Kaiser is revealed to have a Dragonite, a fully evolved, rare, powerful Pokemon that, at the time of the episode's production, had barely been seen in the anime at all. For Japanese audiences, this was a significant reveal, proof that truly powerful Pokemon existed in the world and could be found by those who knew where to look. Western audiences who skipped directly over this episode in their version of the broadcast timeline simply never got that moment. Dragonite remained more mysterious to international fans than it might otherwise have been, partly because the episode that humanized it never reached them. The episode involving Jinx and the Christmas season, titled Holiday Hijinks in its Western dub, aired in Japan but was later pulled from international rotation after a writer named Carol Boston Weatherford published a critique noting that Jinx's original design, with its dark skin, wide pink lips, and flowing blonde hair, bore an uncomfortable resemblance to racist caricatures. The controversy led to Jinx's skin color being changed from black to purple in all subsequent appearances. But the controversy did not stop with new episodes. Old episodes that featured the original Jinx design were edited for re-releases, which means that some physical and digital versions of older episodes look noticeably different from others. If you have ever watched an old Pokemon episode and thought the coloring looked slightly off in a particular scene, that might be why. The episode Beauty and the Beach, which did eventually air in English years after its original Japanese broadcast, was held back for some time because of a scene involving James of Team Rocket wearing an inflatable costume that gave him exaggerated feminine features. The scene was played as absurd comedy in the original Japanese version, but producers in Western markets were concerned about how it would read to young audiences. The irony that critics have pointed out many times since is that the same episode contained sequences of cartoon violence that aired without comment, while a comedic costume scene was considered the problematic element. The inconsistency says something about the specific cultural anxieties that Western localization was navigating at the time. The Tentacool and Tentacruel episode, originally aired in Japan in 1997, was twice withdrawn from American broadcast by Kids WBE following real-world disasters. The episode features a giant Tentacruel destroying a skyscraper's upper floors with its tentacles, a piece of dramatic monster movie imagery that fit entirely within the internal logic of the Pokemon world, but looked far too much like collapsing urban infrastructure following September 11th, 2001. The episode was pulled. It was eventually rebroadcast after Cartoon Network took over the series, but was then pulled a second time following Hurricane Katrina in 2005, as the scenes of flooding and urban destruction were again considered too close to recent events. There is also an episode that was banned not because of its content, but because of its narrator. A Pikachu short featured a narrator named Sakai Noriko, a well-known Japanese entertainer. In 2009, Noriko was arrested for possession and abuse of illegal substances. The episode was immediately pulled from all Japanese broadcast and has never aired anywhere since. The short itself, which depicts the Pichu brothers having adventures in a city, is considered by fans who have seen it to be one of the better Pikachu shorts. But because of events entirely unrelated to its content, it has essentially become a lost episode. There is one more story from behind the anime's curtain that does not involve banning, but does involve the program very nearly being something entirely different. In early planning, Ash Ketchum was not the star. The character who would become Misty, Kasumi in Japan, a water-loving trainer with a sharp personality and a talent for battle, was considered as the show's protagonist by some in the production team. A female lead capturing and battling Pokemon with Ash in a secondary role. The pitch was ultimately rejected. The network executives involved in the production felt that a male lead would sell better internationally, a judgment that reflects both the commercial calculations of the era and a significant underestimation of who the actual audience for Pokemon would turn out to be. The franchise sold to boys and girls in roughly equal measures almost from the start. The decision to sideline Misty from the lead role was a practical one that missed the broader truth of what Pokemon was becoming. Part 5. The Dark Corners of the Pokédex. Lore that keeps you up at night. The Pokédex in every game is presented as a scientific reference tool, a digital encyclopedia. The impression it creates is of an objective record, facts about creatures assembled by researchers over many years. What nobody tells you when you are 8 years old playing the original games is that if you read the Pokédex entries carefully, the world they describe is, in places, genuinely horrifying. The entries have grown darker as the franchise has continued. The early games kept things relatively wholesome, descriptions of a Pokemon's habitat, its diet, how fast it can fly. But by the third and fourth generations, the writers had begun to use the Pokédex as a place to deposit information about the Pokemon world that would have been too dark to include in the games themselves. The result is a hidden layer of lore that sits underneath the cheerful surface of the franchise, like something cold and still. Yamask, introduced in the fifth generation's Black and White, looks harmless on the surface, a small shadowy figure holding a golden mask. The Pokédex entry in Pokemon Black reads as follows. And this is a genuine, official entry in a game rated E for everyone. Each of them carries a mask that used to be its face when it was human. Sometimes they look at it and cry. Let that settle for a moment. Yamask was a person. The mask it carries is a death mask in the most literal possible sense, a cast of its own face made at the moment of death. And Yamask still has memories of being human. It looks at the face it used to wear, and it mourns. It experiences grief over what it has lost. In Pokemon Black 2 and White 2, the entry is expanded. These Pokemon arose from the spirits of people interred in graves. Each retains memories of its former life. You are catching the mourning ghost of a dead person and using it to battle. This is rated E for everyone. Yamask evolves into Cofagrigus, which the Pokédex describes as a golden sarcophagus that lures in grave robbers and traps them inside its body, transforming them into mummies while still alive. The progression from grieving ghost to active killer is detailed across multiple games with the casual tone of a nature documentary. Dryfloon, which looks exactly like a children's party balloon and first appears in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl as a cute flying ghost type, has been the subject of increasingly specific Pokédex entries across multiple generations. The Diamond and Pearl entries note that it is formed from the souls of both people and Pokemon, and that it tugs on the hands of children to steal them away. The Sun entry, in a game released in 2016, is the most precise. Stories go that it grabs the hands of small children and drags them away to the afterlife. It dislikes heavy children, that last sentence, the clinical specificity of it. It dislikes heavy children, as though this is a creature with preferences and criteria, as though it has assessed children by weight and found some of them acceptable for abduction. It is either a deeply unintentional, darkly comedic line, or a deliberately unsettling piece of characterization from a writer who knew exactly what they were doing. Either way, it is in there. In the Moon entry for the same Pokemon. If its body bursts, its soul spills out with a screaming sound. Gengar, one of the original 151 and arguably the most iconic ghost type in the entire franchise, has been given increasingly disturbing context across the later games. The Moon entry states, it apparently wishes for a traveling companion. Since it was once human itself, it tries to create one by taking the lives of other humans. Gengar was a person. Gengar is lonely. Gengar is solving its loneliness by killing other people so they can become Gengar too. Your beloved shadow ghost with the wide grin was once a human being and is now building a community of murdered humans to keep itself company. Pokemon X adds another dimension. Sometimes on a dark night, your shadow thrown by a streetlight will suddenly and startlingly overtake you. It is actually a Gengar running past you, pretending to be your shadow. This is not a metaphor. The Pokédex is telling you that Gengar literally follows living humans through city streets at night, impersonating their shadows, waiting for the right moment to feed. Cubone has one of the franchise's most famous sad backstories. It wears the skull of its deceased mother on its head as a helmet. What fewer people know is that early concept art for Cubone reportedly showed multiple skull designs, as though the original intention was that each Cubone would wear the skull of a different species, carrying a unique personal tragedy rather than a standardized one. That idea never made it into the games. The uniform skull is haunting enough on its own, but Cubone's lore connects to something even stranger. In the original Pokemon Red and Blue, there's a location called the Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town, a 7-story memorial building where deceased Pokemon are mourned and buried. Near the top of the tower, there's a ghost. Not a ghost-type Pokemon, an actual ghost, a spirit that cannot be interacted with until you obtain a specific item called the Sylph Scope. When you finally see it with the Sylph Scope, the ghost is revealed to be the spirit of a Marowak, the evolved form of Cubone. It is a mother Marowak killed by the criminal organization Team Rocket, whose ghost is protecting her child. The implication is that the Cubone found below the tower is the same Cubone who lost its mother to Team Rocket, whose mother's skull it is wearing. This is all embedded in a game ostensibly designed for young children. The grief of the Crobanage in Lavender Town, presented quietly and never underlined, is one of the most genuinely moving moments in first-generation Pokemon. It is easy to walk past without fully understanding what you are seeing, and that is perhaps what makes it work. Parasect is a Pokemon that appears on the surface to be a simple bug and grass type, an insect with mushrooms growing on its back. The Pokédex entries across multiple games reveal something considerably more disturbing. The mushrooms, identified as a parasitic fungus called a Tochukaso, have grown over time to essentially consume their host. By the time Parasect reaches its final evolution, the entries note that the mushroom has taken over, that the original creature inside is effectively dead, and that the mushroom now controls the body entirely. What you are catching and battling is not an insect anymore. It is a fungus wearing a dead insect as a vehicle. Some Pokédex entries note that Parasect's movements are dictated entirely by the Tochukaso, and that its blank white eyes, it has no pupils, unlike its pre-evolution, indicate that there is nothing left inside looking out. This is a real biological phenomenon. Ophiocordyceps fungi actually do infect insects in the real world, altering their behavior and eventually killing them. The designers of Parasect knew exactly what they were referencing. They built a children's collecting game creature around the image of a zombie insect controlled by a brain-eating fungus. The human into Pokemon transformation is a thread that runs through the lore of many ghost and psychic types. Gengar, as mentioned, Yamask, but also Kadabra. The Pokédex entry in Pokemon Sun reads, "A theory exists that this Pokemon was a young boy who could not control his psychic abilities and ended up transformed into this Pokemon." Pokemon Fire Red is slightly more specific. It is rumored that a boy with psychic abilities suddenly transformed into Kadabra while he was assisting research into extrasensory powers. This is not confirmed. It is presented as a theory, as a rumor. But the word rumor in a Pokédex entry in a world where the Pokédex is presented as a scientific instrument carries a different weight than it would in our world. In the Pokemon universe, the Pokédex is supposed to tell you the truth about creatures. A rumor in the Pokédex is less "we do not know" and more "we know but cannot say officially." The Kadabra you are using to battle is, by the internal logic of the franchise's primary scientific reference tool, possibly a missing boy. The franchise has leaned into this unease more deliberately in later generations. Mimikyu, introduced in Sun and Moon, wears a disguise that looks like Pikachu because it desperately wants to be loved. The Pokédex notes that a gust of wind once revealed what was underneath the disguise to a passing trainer, who went home and died painfully that very night. Anfroslas, an ice and ghost type from Diamond and Pearl, freezes any humans or Pokemon it finds appealing, and brings them back to its den as decorations. The Sun entry. When it finds humans or Pokemon it likes, it freezes them and takes them to its chilly den, where they become decorations. These entries do not exist by accident. the writers of Pokemon's Pokédex text have been quietly building a shadow canon, a version of the Pokemon world that is stranger, colder, and more morally complicated than the cheerful adventure game suggests. Reading all of the Pokédex entries in sequence across all generations is not like reading a scientific reference text. It is more like reading the mythology of a world that runs on the same rules as a fairy tale, where the line between human and creature is porous, where ghosts are literal and everywhere, and where the collecting and battling that the games present as wholesome adventure is also, in the franchise's own terms, a relationship between humans and beings of enormous power and occasionally violent purpose. Part 6: Lavender Town and the Urban Legends That Raised a Generation. There's a stretch of road in Pokemon Red and Blue that every player who grew up with the original games remembers. You travel north from Celadon City or west from Fuchsia, and eventually the map leads you to a small, gray town with no gym, no department store, no major trainer to battle. Lavender Town? The music changes when you enter. Where the other town themes are upbeat or atmospheric in a cozy way, the Lavender Town theme is something else entirely. A sparse, high-pitched, discordant melody that sounds like the bells at a funeral run through a machine that does not fully understand what bells are for. It loops. It does not resolve into warmth. It just continues, slightly wrong in a way that is hard to articulate. The town is built around the Pokemon Tower, a graveyard for deceased Pokemon. The first floor is populated with trainers who have come to mourn. The upper floors are haunted. The spirits of dead Pokemon drift through the levels. And near the top of the tower, as already mentioned, is the ghost of a murdered mother. The whole area is, by the standards of children's entertainment, genuinely unusual. It is a place in a game about catching animals that is explicitly about grief and death. The music is real, and its strangeness is real, and the atmosphere it creates is real. What is not real is what the internet decided to build around it, starting in the early 2000s. The creepypasta known as Lavender Town Syndrome first appeared around 2010 and spread rapidly through Pokemon fan communities and horror-focused websites. The story it told was elaborate and specific. In the original Japanese release of Pokemon Red and Green, the Lavender Town theme had contained extremely high-pitched binaural tones, frequencies that adults could not hear, but that children, with their more sensitive hearing, could detect. The tones, the story claimed, had caused psychological disturbances in children who played the game. Headaches, insomnia, erratic behavior, and, in the most extreme version of the tale, a wave of suicides among Japanese children between the ages of 7 and 12 in the spring of 1996. The creepypasta stated that these suicides were covered up by Nintendo with assistance from the Japanese government, and that the Lavender Town music had been altered for subsequent releases and international versions. The story spread because it was told well and because it attached itself to things that were real. The Pokemon Shock incident, the seizures caused by Episode 38, had genuinely happened. The Lavender Town music genuinely is unsettling. The original Japanese release of Red and Green genuinely does have slightly different audio from the international versions. These real elements gave the fictional framework enough texture to feel plausible to people who were not looking too closely. But none of the central claims are true. There is no documented evidence of any unusual spike in child suicides in Japan in early 1996. The named source for the story, a supposed Game Freak employee named Ms. Satuhare, has never been verified as a real person and appears in no records outside of the creepypasta itself. Running the Lavender Town music through a spectrogram does not reveal hidden images. The ghost images and unknown letters that circulated as supposed evidence were created by fans who manipulated the visualizations. The music does not contain binaural beats designed to cause psychological harm. What the music does contain, and this is simply a quality of the Game Boy's audio hardware, are overtones and frequencies that interact oddly with the tiny speaker most players used. The original Game Boy's audio reproduction was limited and somewhat harsh. Certain notes played on that hardware have a tinny, slightly off quality that more sophisticated speakers smooth over. The Lavender Town theme is not designed to harm you. It is designed to feel appropriate for a graveyard, and it succeeds so well at that design goal that it created a mythology around itself. The fact that the Lavender Town theme sounds different between the Japanese red and green and the international red and blue is real. But the reason is banal. The localization team adjusted music as part of their standard process, the same way they adjusted Pokemon cries and removed the old man's drunkenness. The adjustments to the Lavender Town theme made it slightly more melodic and less harshly atonal for Western audiences. Not because the original was causing suicides, because the original was considered slightly too abrasive for the international market. What is interesting about the Lavender Town Syndrome creepypasta, looking back at it now, is what it was actually doing. The story emerged in the late 2000s and early 2010s, at the exact moment when the first generation of Pokemon players were entering their mid-20s. They had grown up with these games. They had carried the images and sounds of Pokemon through their entire childhoods. And suddenly, they were adults with the internet tools to look back at their childhood through a different lens, to take the things that had felt mysterious or slightly wrong and build elaborate stories around them. The Lavender Town story is, in a real sense, a piece of folk art about nostalgia and unease. It is what happens when a generation tries to explain why certain things from their childhood felt different than the rest. Why one corner of a cheerful game carried an atmosphere that the rest did not. Why a particular melody stuck in the memory in a way that happy music generally does not. The creepypasta is wrong about its facts and right about its emotions. The Pokemon Company has been quietly aware of Lavender Town's reputation for decades. In 2023, as part of a project called Project Voltage, a collaboration between Pokemon and the Vocaloid music scene, the composer Polka Dot Stingray used the Lavender Town theme as the basis for a song called Ghost Dive. It was treated not as something to be ashamed of or explained away, but as a piece of the franchise's musical heritage worth revisiting. The Ghost Town's music has its own legacy now, separate from the game that produced it. There is a counterpart to Lavender Town's dark mythology in the real event that inspired it. The actual thing that caused real harm. The Pokemon Shock incident had an aftermath that extended beyond the show's hiatus. After episode 38 aired and 685 children were hospitalized, the entire team of animators who had worked on the series went back through the previous 37 episodes to review their lighting. The concern was that the same animation techniques had been used elsewhere, perhaps not as intensely, but potentially still problematic. Several episodes had sequences re-edited or digitally dimmed before they were rebroadcast. Viewers watching the early episodes of the anime on DVD or streaming today are not watching entirely the same cut that aired in Japan in 1997. The lighting has been softened in places. The version you know has already been adjusted. The music issue between the Japanese and international releases is worth examining on its own terms because there are real differences between the two versions that have nothing to do with the creepypasta. The original Japanese Pokemon Red and Green were built entirely around the Game Boy's audio capabilities, a small, tinny speaker producing sound through a 4-channel audio chip. The tones produced by that hardware are harsher and more digital sounding than the smoother audio you get from later hardware or from headphones. Several pieces of music in the original Japanese versions were adjusted during the localization process, not only for the Lavender Town theme, but for multiple routes and towns. The localization teams were working in foreign markets with different expectations about what was appropriate or comfortable to hear in children's entertainment. The Lavender Town adjustment is real. The international version of the theme is modestly different from the Japanese original, slightly more melodic, with some of the most abrasive overtones softened. This real difference, easily audible if you compare the two versions side by side, was one of the raw materials the creepypasta used. The story claimed the adjustment was made to remove dangerous frequencies. In reality, it was made to make the music less unpleasant on Game Boy speakers, the same reason that Pidgey's cry was softened and Charizard's roar was adjusted. Localization routinely touched the audio. Lavender Town was just the location where the existing eeriness made the adjustment feel significant in retrospect. What the Lavender Town creepypasta actually accomplished culturally is worth reflecting on. It created a shared vocabulary for a specific kind of childhood unease that would otherwise have been difficult to articulate. The people who encountered it at the age of 22 or 23 were not children anymore, but they were adults who remembered being children, who remembered the exact specific feeling of that music starting when they walked into that gray town. The creepypasta gave that feeling a name and a history. It transformed an emotional memory into a narrative. Whether or not the narrative was true was almost secondary to the function it served, which was to say, this thing you remember feeling was real, and there was a reason for it, and the reason was larger and stranger than you knew. That is a service that folklore has always provided. The creepypasta is a piece of internet mythology, but mythology has always been the way communities process experiences that do not fit neatly into ordinary explanation. Part 7. What Could Have Been. The Beta Pokemon and the Creatures Time Forgot. In May 2018, something remarkable happened. A prototype of Pokemon Gold and Silver that had been demonstrated at the Space World Trade Show in November 1997, months before the finished games were released, surfaced online. The ROM was acquired by data miners, and what it contained rewrote significant portions of what fans believed they understood about how Generation 2 had been developed. The Space World 1997 demo was not a polished preview build. It was a working prototype, an early version of the game still far from its finished form. And it was populated, in part, by Pokemon that had never existed in any release game. There were more baby Pokemon than anyone had expected. The second generation had introduced the concept of pre-evolution baby forms for several first-generation Pokemon. Pichu before Pikachu, Magby before Magmar, Cleffa before Clefairy. The beta suggested that this was supposed to be a much more extensive phenomenon. Baby forms existed in the demo for Meowth, Vulpix, Grimer, Doduo, Paras, Ponyta, and others. A tiny little Meowth baby was specifically noted as being inspired by 5 yen coins, connecting it to the adult Meowth's obsession with money in a thematic way that the finished games never had the chance to establish. A baby Tangela, the vine-wrapped Pokemon, was designed to reveal more of the body hidden under the vines. A tantalizing anatomical detail that fans had wondered about for years finally sketched in, and then abandoned. The starters for Gold and Silver had also been different. The Chikorita line was largely intact, but the original Fire and Water starters told a different story. In place of Cyndaquil and its evolution into the volcano-backed Typhlosion, the early demo showed a line of bear Pokemon with fire-based typing. Small, warm, heavy creatures whose design aesthetic is more immediately feral and dangerous than the shy, rolled-up Cyndaquil who made it into the final game. The Fire Bear line had names that fans have translated as Honoguma, Volbear, and a final form whose name contained the word for dynamite. Game Freak has never revisited these designs in any released game. A fire-type bear, despite appearing multiple times on fan wish lists over the decades since the leak, has never made it into a finished Pokemon product. The water starter line was even more surprising. A seal-like creature that evolved into a more powerful aquatic form, with a design that bears enough similarity to the 7th generation water starter Poplio and its evolution line that fans have speculated the designs were archived and eventually repurposed rather than discarded entirely. It is the kind of connection that cannot be verified but refuses to feel coincidental. The beta also contained evolutions for Pokemon that have never received evolutions in the finished games. Farfetch'd, the duck with a leak who has been a fan favorite precisely because of how obviously underserved it is mechanically, had an evolution in the Space World demo. A more imposing avian figure, sometimes described by fans who analyze the sprites as a kind of regal swan form. This never made it into Gold and Silver, and Farfetch'd continued without evolution until Pokemon Sword and Shield finally gave it a regional variant called Sirfetch'd in 2019, more than 2 decades after the original unevolved evolution had been considered and abandoned. Umbreon, the dark-type evolution that was eventually released in Gold and Silver, was Poison-type in the beta. The early version of Umbreon had different type attributes than the creature who made it into the finished game, which means the balance calculations for its stats and moveset were entirely different. The Umbreon that players know and love, with its ring-marked black fur and its tank-like defensive stats, is a significantly altered version of what was first designed. There are stranger things in the beta data than altered types. A creature called Kotora and its evolution Raitora, small electric tiger cubs, were in the prototype and never made it into any released game. Fans have noted that the design of Manectric's Mega Evolution, released many generations later, bears such a strong resemblance to Raitora that some believe the design was archived rather than deleted, and eventually reused in a different context. Again, this cannot be confirmed, but the resemblance is close enough that it is hard not to consider. The beta data also revealed something about Pokemon that would only be released much later: the silhouettes and basic data for Leafeon and Glaceon, evolutions that were not officially released until Diamond and Pearl in the 4th generation, existed in the Gold and Silver prototype. They were designed, named, and built into the foundational architecture of Generation 2. Then they were removed and held back for nearly a decade. When they were finally released in 2006, players had no idea they were finally getting Pokemon that had been designed almost 10 years earlier. Separate from the Gold and Silver beta, there are unused designs scattered through the files of other games in ways that suggest the franchise's history is full of these near misses. In the files of Ruby and Sapphire, data miners have found audio cries that do not correspond to any Pokemon in those games or any other released game. The tones are complete and polished, not the rough placeholder sounds you would expect from test data. They were designed for specific creatures that were fully intended for inclusion, and then pulled before release. Whatever Pokemon those cries were designed for, their visual designs are gone. All that remains is the sound of a creature that never was. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl originally planned to include many more Pokemon with gender differences than made it into the finished game. A leak of early gender-differentiated sprites from the game's development period revealed designs where the majority of Pokemon were supposed to look slightly different depending on their gender, different coloring, different markings, different physical features. The system was heavily scaled back by the time the games were finished, leaving only a handful of Pokemon with noticeable gender differences. The infrastructure for a much more extensive system is there in the code. It was built and then mostly dismantled. There is something both melancholy and fascinating about looking at the history of what Pokemon almost was. Each generation carries the ghosts of its own development inside it. The creatures that were designed and discarded, the features that were built and then stripped away, the evolutions that were drawn and then archived. The franchise we know is the result of thousands of these small decisions and reversals, every one of them made by specific people in a small company in Japan working under real constraints of time and memory and creative debate. Part 8. The Trading Card Underground, Misprints, Shadows, and the First Edition Grail. In 1999, the Pokemon trading card game arrived in the United States. The timing was near perfect. The anime had already been airing for months, building a fan base that was ready to extend their engagement with the franchise into something physical. The cards sold out almost immediately. Wizards of the Coast, the company that had been licensed to produce and distribute the English language TCG, had printed what seemed like an enormous initial run. It was not enough. The first print run of the base set, the original 102 cards, is now known in collecting circles as the first edition run, and it is distinguished by a small black stamp with the text Edition 1 on the left side of the card artwork. These cards sold out before what collectors call Pokemania had fully taken hold in the United States, which means they were largely purchased by early adopters and children, rather than the collectors and speculators who came later. The result is that first edition base set cards, particularly in high grades, are extremely rare and genuinely pristine condition. They were carried in pockets, they were played without sleeves, they absorbed the fingerprints and the bending and the general chaos of being beloved by small children. A PSA Grade 10, a card certified as being in essentially perfect mint condition, for a first edition base set Charizard, has sold for prices in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. As of May 2022, when grading company CGC had graded nearly 23,000 first edition base set cards, only about 252 of them were Charizards. Of those 252, fewer than 20 graded at the highest levels. None had ever received a perfect grade of 10. The grail of Pokemon card collecting, the card that appears most often in headlines and auction results, does not have a single confirmed example in genuinely perfect condition among the original print run. Every first edition base set Charizard that has been handled has something. A touch of surface wear, a light edge ding, the evidence of having existed in the world. The second print run of the base set removed the first edition stamp, but kept everything else identical. These cards are known as shadowless cards because they share a visual quirk with the first edition print. There is no drop shadow along the right edge of the artwork frame. The shadow, a subtle line of darker shading that creates a three-dimensional pop effect on the artwork, was added in the third print run, which is called Unlimited Edition. The addition of the shadow was both an aesthetic improvement and a production standardization, but it means that the first two print runs of the original card set can be distinguished from everything that came after by this small visual detail. A shadowless Charizard in high grade is worth substantially less than its first edition counterpart, but still tens of thousands of dollars. The visual difference between a shadowless card and an unlimited card is something a collector can identify in seconds, but that most players in 1999 would never have noticed. The generation of children who traded and played with these cards had no idea they were handling objects that would appreciate to this degree. There's a card that occupies an even more specific place in early Pokemon collecting mythology. In the early days of the Wizards of the Coast era, pre-release events were held for new card expansions. Tournaments where players could access new cards before their official release date, with promotional stamps on the cards to mark them as pre-release versions. Somewhere in the chaos of early production, A batch of Raichu cards was apparently stamped with the pre-release marking that was intended for promotional versions of other cards. The resulting cards, known as pre-release Raichu, entered collecting mythology as either an impossibly rare genuine misprint or an elaborate hoax, depending on who you asked. Wizards of the Coast gave ambiguous statements about the pre-release Raichu over the years, neither fully confirming nor definitively denying its existence. Only a small number of collectors ever claimed to own one, and the provenances of those copies were difficult to verify. It became, in the early 2000s Pokemon card community, the equivalent of a ghost story, a card that might exist, that a handful of people swore they had seen, that nobody could fully confirm or disprove. The mystery of the pre-release Raichu is to the trading card game what the mystery of Mew was to the video games, a rumored secret that kept people engaged and searching. The Ancient Mew card, distributed in cinemas during the second Pokemon movie, is one of the strangest physical objects the franchise ever produced. The card was designed to look like an ancient artifact, printed with a stylized, archaic script and a holographic image of Mew. The text was entirely in Futhark runic script, which is a real ancient writing system. Most people who received the card at the movie theater had no idea it said anything legible at all, assuming the text was purely decorative. It was not. The text, when translated, read as a description of Mew's abilities and characteristics, presented as though carved by an ancient civilization that had encountered the creature. The Ancient Mew eventually found itself banned from official tournament play. The reasoning was that in certain tournament formats, the card's unique properties and unusual design created specific legal interpretations that produced unbalanced strategies. The ban happened swiftly enough that most of the public, including many of the people who owned the card, were unaware that it had briefly been a tournament legal card at all. The card most people think of as a piece of movie merchandise, something to put in a binder, not to play with, was, for a brief window, a legal competitive card that tournament organizers had to specifically forbid. The Pokemon card boom of the late 1990s produced its own urban legends in the same way the video games had. In the trading card community, a rumor spread that psychic-type cards were somehow cursed. The specific claim varied. Some said the purple coloring was associated with bad luck. Some claimed that building a psychic-heavy deck caused losses that had no statistical explanation. The rumor was widespread enough that some children refused to play with psychic cards at all. Wizards of the Coast actually had to release public statements debunking the curse. The idea that a card type in a collectible card game had supernatural properties is, in retrospect, remarkable evidence of how deep the Pokemon mythology had penetrated into children's imaginations. The world building of the franchise had become so compelling that players were extending it outward into the real objects associated with the game. Part 9, Hidden in Plain Sight. The Easter eggs, leftover code, and developer jokes. Nobody was supposed to find Game Freak has, across nearly 3 decades of development, left more material in their games than they intended for players to ever find. Some of this was deliberate, the kind of hidden humor or small tributes that developers embed for their own amusement, never expecting players to dig deep enough to encounter them. Some of it was accidental, code from earlier in development that was never fully removed. And some of it falls somewhere between the two. Things that were probably meant to stay hidden, but that the developers knew, on some level, that the most dedicated players would eventually uncover. In Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, the game includes an internal calendar that tracks real-world dates. Most games that do this use the calendar for relatively simple purposes: time of day lighting, seasonal events, that kind of thing. Diamond and Pearl do something considerably more unusual. On specific dates that correspond to real-world historical events, the wild Pokemon encounter rates in the game are subtly altered. On certain national holidays in the United States and internationally, the rates shift. But the more striking adjustment is this. On dates associated with mass tragedy, the bombing of Hiroshima, September 11th, the encounter rates decrease. Wild Pokemon appear less often. The routes feel quieter. This adjustment was implemented by the developers as what appears to be a quiet act of respect. They did not announce it. There is no in-game explanation for why the tall grass seems emptier on certain days. The adjustment exists purely in the code, visible only to people who tracked encounter rates over extended periods and noticed the anomaly, or to data miners who eventually found the underlying date-checking conditions. A children's game about collecting monsters contains within it a reflection of real-world grief, encoded quietly, never meant to be noticed. Pokemon Sun and Moon contains a tribute of a different kind. Near the harbor in the game's opening city, there's a parked truck on an inaccessible dock. It does nothing. You can see it but not reach it. It is the Vermilion City truck, the one that generations of players had believed hid Mew, reconstructed in a new generation as a knowing wink at 20 years of mythology. The developers placed it there specifically for the players who were there at the beginning, who spent hours in 1999 pushing the invisible trucks in their memories. It is a memorial to a rumor, also in Sun and Moon. If you find a way to walk behind the counters in a Pokemon Center, an area that is normally blocked off to the player, the Nurse Joy characters have hidden dialogue lines scolding you for being somewhere you should not be. These lines are stored in the game as ordinary dialogue, accessible in the same way as any other conversation, but they can only trigger in circumstances that require the player to deliberately exploit movement glitches or unusual geometry to reach restricted areas. The developers wrote text specifically for a situation that should be impossible to reach. They anticipated that someone would find a way to get behind that counter, and they left them a message. In Pokemon Sword and Shield, the camping feature includes a system for interacting with your Pokemon while at camp. Players can cook curry, throw toys, and watch their Pokemon react. Most of the reactions are common and occur frequently, but certain Pokemon species have rare animation states, behaviors that trigger at something like a 1 in several hundred chance, where they perform unique, species-specific interactions with the food or the environment that do not occur under normal circumstances. A Pokemon might refuse to eat on a very rare occasion, displaying an animation that suggests a personality trait. Another might steal food in a way that acknowledges the player's presence with a particular expression. These moments are real, documented by players who spent extended time in camping mode, but they are rare enough that the majority of players who have owned Sword and Shield have never seen them. The Emerald game includes a slot machine Easter egg so deeply buried that it might be the single most inaccessible piece of content in the franchise's history. In the Battle Frontier, the slot machines in the facility have specific programmed outcomes for each individual role. Among the billions of possible sequences, there is one specific combination that produces not just a jackpot, but a unique congratulatory message from the developers. The odds of hitting this combination naturally are approximately 1 in 65,536, meaning that a player would need to pull the slot machine handle more than 65,000 times to have an even chance of seeing it once. The message was discovered through data mining, not through natural play. Nobody in the game's history has credibly reported hitting this combination legitimately. It exists as a message in a bottle from Game Freak to whoever happens to be standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, which has so far been nobody. There is a hidden flag in Pokemon Red and Blue related to Professor Oak that speaks to the most loyal players. In the original games, when you first encounter the old man in Viridian City who is blocking your path north, his stated reason differs between the Japanese and international versions. In the original Japanese red and green, he tells you he cannot let you pass because he is drunk. The international localization changed this to say he is waiting for his morning coffee. The underlying game flag, the condition the game checks to decide whether the old man is blocking the path, is the same in both versions. But the reason for it transforms significantly between markets. The specific piece of world building that explained why a random old man was preventing you from accessing the northern routes was, in its original form, considerably more human and considerably more realistic than the sanitized coffee explanation. Both versions of the character have spent 30 years preventing players from going north. One of them was just more honest about why. The debug menu for the international versions of Red and Blue contains another remnant of development humor. In the code for the player naming system, the default internal values for the player character and the rival were set to Nenten and Sony respectively. These values are never displayed during normal gameplay. They are only visible if you access the debug tools or use hacking software. But some developer, at some point in the localization process, decided that the rival, the character who exists to be your obstacle and your benchmark, who you are always trying to surpass, should be internally named after Nintendo's chief competitor. The player is Nintendo. The rival is Sony. You are playing a game in which you are Nintendo and your rival is Sony, and you are going to beat your rival. And this joke is buried so deep in the code that almost nobody who has ever played the game knows it is there. There is a footnote to the Shadowless card story that is worth its own moment. The first print run of the English base set was distributed and sold out before the full weight of what was happening with Pokemon in American culture had registered with retailers. Toy stores and hobby shops had placed conservative initial orders because they did not fully believe the reports from Japan about how popular this franchise was going to be. They were wrong. The cards sold out in hours in many locations. Parents were standing in lines before stores opened. Secondary market prices jumped within weeks of release. The shops that had ordered cautiously had nothing to reorder from because the second print run took time to produce. The window between the first and second print runs, the window during which the shadowless cards were the only ones available when Pokemania was hitting its initial peak, was brief enough that the supply of cards produced during that window is genuinely constrained. The shadow is added to the third print run. By then, millions more cards had been ordered, and millions more players were in the market. The first two runs, particularly the first edition, were orphaned in time, produced before the wave fully arrived. The base set Shadowless Charizard sells for so much because of this specific timing accident. Not because there is anything magical about a card without a drop shadow, but because the absence of that shadow places the card precisely within the first chaotic weeks of a cultural phenomenon. The shadow is not an aesthetic detail. It is a timestamp. The people who kept their cards in binders, who put them in individual protective sleeves and treated them as collectibles rather than game pieces, did not generally know at the time that they were doing something unusual. Most players used their cards. They played with them. The wear on almost every surviving first edition card tells this story. Edge whitening from shuffling, surface scratching from handling, corner dings from being carried. The cards that survived in pristine condition mostly did so by accident, packed away unworn in collections, buried in closets, forgotten rather than preserved. The value of a PSA 10 Pokemon card is, in a very direct sense, the value of something that was loved carefully enough, or lucky enough to escape the full force of being beloved by a child. The Japanese card market developed in parallel with the English one, and has its own parallel history of rare and sought-after cards. The original Japanese base set, known in Japan as the Expansion Pack, was released in October 1996, before the English cards existed at all. Japanese cards from this era have different printing characteristics, different rarity distributions, and a specific visual quality that collectors distinguish from the English printings. The Japanese market for vintage Pokemon cards is extensive and operates on its own set of valuations, with certain Japanese exclusive promos and tournament prizes reaching extraordinary prices independent of the English card economy. Part 9b. More hidden code and forgotten features. The hidden features buried in Game Freak's released titles extend considerably further than most players realize. In Pokemon Yellow, the third first-generation release, which came out after the anime had established the franchise's global identity, Pikachu's cry was voiced by Kei Otani, the voice actress who voiced Pikachu in the anime. This was an unusual technical achievement for a Game Boy game. The result is that when you interact with Pikachu in Yellow, the cry you hear is not a synthesized chiptune sound, but a small recorded audio sample of the actual anime voice performance. Players who noticed this at the time probably assumed it was a standard game sound. It was not. It was a tiny piece of the anime embedded in the cartridge, using specialized compression to fit an audio sample into a format the Game Boy could play. The Surfing Pikachu minigame in Yellow, accessible only if you had a specific event Pikachu from either Pokemon Stadium or a special Nintendo distribution, is one of the earliest examples of exclusive content locked behind events in a mainline Pokemon game. To play the minigame, your Pikachu needed to know the move Surf, a move that Pikachu cannot normally learn in gameplay. The only way to have a Pikachu with Surf was through Stadium or through the event. Players who did not have access to those resources could not unlock the minigame at all. It was a piece of content that technically existed in every copy of the game but was effectively invisible to most players. The early 2000s internet eventually made the steps widely known, but in 1998 when Yellow was new, most players had no idea the game contained anything you could activate by surfing on Pikachu's back. The Pokemon Diamond and Pearl Underground, the below-ground wireless multiplayer area where players could dig for fossils and set up secret bases, had a specific mechanic for obtaining Spiritomb that is now legendary for its absurdity. Spiritomb, a ghost and dark type with no weaknesses in its generation, could only be obtained by placing a specific item in the underground called the Odd Keystone, and then talking to 32 different players in the underground area. 32 different players, not 32 interactions with the same player or 32 NPC characters. 32 different real people with their own copies of Diamond or Pearl. In an era before the internet made wireless communication trivially easy, before online play was standard on the DS, this requirement was genuinely difficult to meet unless you happened to live in an area with high game density or attended a specific gaming event. Some players at the time compared the process to a locked room puzzle from a game manual that had been mistranslated. Official guides described the requirement correctly, but the description was so unusual that many players assumed they must be misunderstanding something. Spiritomb became, in Diamond and Pearl's early life, a status symbol among players who could demonstrate they had actually obtained it legitimately. Everyone else used cheat codes and hoped nobody asked too many questions. The Pokemon Crystal game, the third iteration of Gold and Silver, released in 2000, was the first game in the franchise to feature animated Pokemon sprites, a feature that would not return in full until the 5th generation. Every Pokemon in the game had a small idle animation, a bounce, a ripple, a slight shift of position. What is not widely known is that the developers almost abandoned the feature during development. The Game Boy Color's processing power was limited enough that running animated sprites for every Pokemon in the game created a technical load the hardware struggled with. The animations were compressed aggressively, frames reduced to the absolute minimum necessary to suggest motion. And even then, the team was uncertain whether the hardware would handle them consistently. The animations were kept in, but just barely, and only through a process of relentless optimization that the average player would never see. The return of animated sprites in black and white a full decade later on hardware with exponentially more processing power produced animations that were similarly criticized for being limited in scope. The lesson from Crystal, that animation creates player connection and brings Pokemon to life in a way that static sprites cannot, was remembered. The implementation was constrained by pragmatism. Generation 5's sprites are animated but simple, which echoes Crystal in a direct line. In Pokemon Emerald, the Battle Frontier included a facility called the Battle Pyramid, a location where players navigated a dark, maze-like structure battling trainers in conditions of reduced visibility. Deep in the game files, data miners have found references to a second, unreleased facility, with properties suggesting it would have functioned as a mirror version of the first. A reverse pyramid, descended from the top rather than ascended from the bottom. The data for this facility is incomplete, existing only as references and a partial framework rather than a built location. It suggests that the Battle Frontier was at some point intended to be larger than what shipped. The presence of a reversed pyramid, structurally the inverse of one of the game's defining late-game challenges, implies a design philosophy of deliberate symmetry that was ultimately scaled back due to cartridge constraints. The Fire Red and Leaf Green remakes, released in 2004, contain an unused map that data miners have identified as bearing a strong structural resemblance to Olivine City from the Johto region. Olivine City is one of the coastal cities from Gold and Silver, a port town with a lighthouse and a harbor. Its presence as a sketched map in Fire Red and Leaf Green has led to sustained speculation that Game Freak at some point considered expanding the remakes to include at least part of Johto as a post-game destination, mirroring the way Gold and Silver had expanded into Kanto after their main story. The map never progressed beyond its placeholder state, but it implies a version of Fire Red and Leaf Green that would have essentially been the definitive Generation 1 experience. Kanto as the main story, Johto accessible afterward, all on a single cartridge. The version that actually shipped is smaller, but the ambition for something larger is preserved as ghost architecture in the files. Part 9.5. Localization's Long Shadow. What changed? When the games crossed the ocean. There is an entire invisible history of Pokemon that lives in the space between the Japanese originals and the international versions. Localization, the process of adapting a product for a new market, is often described as translation, but it is considerably more expansive than that. When Game Freak's games traveled from Japan to the United States and Europe, entire layers of meaning were adjusted, reassigned, or removed. Some of those changes were practical and harmless. Some were significant enough that international players and Japanese players grew up with meaningfully different experiences of the same games. The most immediately personal of these changes involves names. The trainer names in the original Japanese games carry specific meanings and references that the international versions replaced with invented Western-sounding names. Ash Ketchum's Japanese name is Sachi, Sachi Tajiri's own first name, a tribute from the creator to his own childhood. Gary Oak's Japanese name is Shigeru, after Shigeru Miyamoto. In the Japanese anime and games, every time the protagonist faces his rival, you are watching a fictionalized version of a real creative relationship, the younger developer and his mentor, the student and the teacher who believed in him when nobody else did. The international names strip that layer away entirely. Ash and Gary are just Ash and Gary, two boys in a rivalry. Satoshi and Shigeru are a letter from Tajiri to Miyamoto. The names of the original Kanto cities in Japanese are all derived from the names of real Japanese towns and areas. Masura Town, Pallet's Japanese name; Tokiwa City, Viridian; Nibi City, Pewter. The international names replaced these with color references. Pallet Town, Viridian City, Cerulean City, Vermilion City. The Japanese naming creates a sense of place that connects the game world to a real geography. The international naming creates an abstract color-coded map that feels designed rather than derived. Neither is worse than the other, but they produce different atmospheres. The Japanese version of Kanto feels like a stylized version of a real region. The international version feels more like a constructed game world. The Pokemon names themselves underwent significant transformation in localization. In the original beta for Red and Green, before even the final Japanese names were set, the Pokemon that became Coughing and Wheezing were named Nai and La respectively, abbreviations for New York and Los Angeles, referencing the air pollution of those cities. By the time localization was finished, they were Coughing and Wheezing, which are clever enough names, but have lost the specific urban environmental commentary of the originals. Kabuto and Kabutops were originally named Atlantis after Atlantis. Even in the finished Japanese games, Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan carry the names Sawamular and Ebiwalar, references to the Japanese kickboxer Tadashi Sawamura and the boxer Hiroyuki Abihara, respectively. The English names replace these with references to Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan, trading one set of martial arts legends for another, swapping Japanese cultural touchstones for ones more recognizable in the Western market. This pattern, taking a Japanese cultural reference and replacing it with an internationally recognizable Western equivalent, runs throughout the franchise's localization history. It is a reasonable adaptation strategy, but it means that English language players grew up with a version of Pokemon that was already translated twice. Once from Game Freak's internal concepts into Japanese popular culture, and then again from Japanese popular culture into a form designed for international consumption. The version of Pokemon that became a global phenomenon is, to varying degrees, a third-order product, twice removed from the original. The move Splash's history is one of the most discussed localization artifacts in the franchise. In Japanese, the move is called Haneru, which translates as hop or jump. It is a movement, not a water reference. Magikarp uses it because Magikarp desperately flops around, unable to do much of anything. The translation Splash stuck the move conceptually to water, which is why it remains odd that Pokemon with no aquatic connection, Hoppip, Spoink, Boonery, can learn a move called Splash. In Japanese, it makes sense. Hoppip hops. Spoink bounces. The move describes a movement type, not an interaction with water. The English translation introduced a conceptual error that has propagated through every generation since 1998. The anime's localization introduced changes that were sometimes dramatic and sometimes bizarre. In the original Japanese version of the anime, Team Rocket's introductory motto, the one they recite at the beginning of every attempt to steal Pikachu, is a more formal, slightly more poetic piece of language than the English version. The Japanese motto references ideals and dedication in ways that carry a different tone from the campy theatrical energy of prepare for trouble and make it double. Different countries received further variations. Some European dubs rewrote the motto to fit local cadences. Some referenced different concepts entirely. The motto that English-speaking fans know as Team Rocket's defining speech is specific to one market's interpretation of characters whose actual language is something else. There is also the matter of the original Pokemon Red and Green's drunk old man in Viridian City. a detail mentioned earlier but worth expanding on. In the original Japanese version, the old man blocking the North Road cannot move because he is drunk. He says so directly. The localization changed this to morning coffee deprivation. The underlying game condition, the flag that the game checks to determine whether the man is blocking your path, is identical in both versions. The man moves when you have completed the Pokemart errand, regardless of whether you believe he was drunk or caffeinated. But the characterization produced by those two different explanations is meaningfully different. The drunk man is more human, more specific, a bit more world-weary. The coffee man is cleaned up, appropriate, generic. Both are sitting in the same square of pixels on the same route. They are having completely different mornings. The censorship of James's inflatable feminine costume in various international versions of the Beauty and the Beach episode, cut in some countries, aired in others, always treated as the episode's controversial element, even as the combat sequences went unremarked, reflects a consistent pattern in Pokemon's localization. Gender presentation was treated as more sensitive material than violence throughout most of the franchise's history. Brock's constant attention to women was significantly toned down in American dubs compared to the Japanese originals, and in some international markets, he was replaced with a different character entirely for early seasons. The nature photographer Tracy Sketchit, filling his role in some non-English dubs for a period. The character who eventually became iconic is a version of a character that some of the franchise's audiences never encountered in his original form. The changes compound over decades. By the time you are watching English-language Pokemon in 2000 or 2005 or 2010, you are watching a version that has been through multiple layers of cultural filtering, each one making small adjustments that seemed reasonable at the time, and that together add up to a product with a different center of gravity than the original. This is not a complaint. It is an observation about how cultural products travel and how they change shape as they do. The Pokemon that billions of people grew up loving is genuinely a local creature wherever it landed, reshaped to feel native in every market it entered. That is a remarkable thing to have accomplished. It is also worth knowing that somewhere behind the local version, there's an original with different jokes and different names and different reasons for why that old man cannot move in the morning. The Safari Zone mechanic is another example of localized misunderstanding taking root. The catching system in the Safari Zone, where you throw bait to make Pokemon stay, throw rocks to weaken them, and use Safari balls to catch them, was explained to players in slightly different ways in different markets, and the underlying mathematics were never fully communicated in any of them. The counterintuitive reality is that throwing bait often decreases your overall catch rate for certain Pokemon, because while it keeps them in place, it also increases their evasiveness. Rocks increase the chance they will flee but lower their resistance to capture when they stay. The optimal strategy is neither what the game implies nor what most players intuit. Some players who analyzed the mechanics carefully found that the theoretically optimal approach for many Safari Zone encounters was to throw nothing at all and simply throw Safari balls from the start. The whole throwing mechanic, intended to create the feeling of unpredictable wildlife interaction that Tajiri wanted, turned out to obscure rather than reveal what was actually happening mathematically. Game Freak has never fully addressed this. The Safari Zone in later games refined the mechanics, but the original counterintuitive system persisted for multiple generations. The children who spent hours in Fuchsia City Safari Zone trying to catch Scyther or Chansey were working with a system that did not behave the way they thought it did. They succeeded when they succeeded not primarily because of their strategies, but because of random variance. The feeling of the hunt, the unpredictability, the chaos, was real. The idea that you were making meaningful choices was not, at least not in the way the interface suggested. Part 10. The franchise that almost wasn't. near misses, and the decisions that changed everything. Pokemon's history is full of moments where a single different decision would have produced a franchise unrecognizable from the one that exists. Some of these near misses are well known, many are not. Sitting with them is a way of understanding how fragile the things we love actually are. How much of what we grew up with was contingent on specific choices made by specific people in specific moments, any one of which could have gone another way. The most fundamental near miss is the one already described in the first section, Game Freak nearly going bankrupt during development. But it is worth dwelling on just how close that came. At certain points during the 6 years of development, the company had no money to pay employees. The people building Pokemon were working for free, sustained by whatever personal resources they had, because they believed in what they were making. 5 people did not believe enough. They left. Tajiri did not take a salary for extended periods and relied on his family. The investment from Creatures Inc. came late enough in development that without it, the game would simply have remained unfinished. The franchise that generates more annual revenue than any other media property in history was 6 months and a few $100,000 from never existing. Pikachu was not the original choice for the franchise mascot. The manga adaptation of the Pokemon concept that was developed alongside the early games, a series called Pokemon Pocket Monsters, drawn by Kosaku Anakubo, featured Clefairy as the protagonist's main partner. Clefairy was also considered for the anime. It was pink, cute, and well-liked in early testing. The argument for Pikachu came down to specific commercial calculations. Pikachu's yellow color was more visually distinct in merchandise, his electric powers were more exciting to animate in battle sequences, and, crucially, he tested well across both genders in audience research. Clefairy tested somewhat better with girls, but not as broadly. The decision to make Pikachu the face of the franchise was made for marketing reasons, and it turned out to be right in ways that even the people making it probably did not fully anticipate. Pikachu is now arguably the most recognizable fictional character on Earth. Clefairy remains a beloved secondary creature. In the anime, Ash Ketchum was originally written to win the Indigo League. The scripts were drafted. The story logic was in place. Ash had grown across the season, his team was strong, and his loss to a trainer named Richie, which is what actually aired, was a late decision imposed by television executives who felt that winning the league championship too early would stall the show's forward momentum. There would be nowhere to go if the protagonist achieved his stated goal in the first season. The decision to have Ash lose defined the character's arc for decades. The perpetual near victor, always growing, never quite arriving. He eventually became a world champion, but only after more than 20 years and well over 1,000 episodes. That journey was built on the decision made in a production meeting in 1998 to have him lose to Richie in the quarterfinals. The anime itself nearly ended after its first year. In the early episodes, the production team was not certain the show would continue beyond the Indigo League arc. Actual plans were made for a final episode in which Ash returns home to Pallet Town, his journey complete. The show's extraordinary success, driven by the card game boom, the game's ongoing sales, and the genuine popularity of the characters, made continuing not just viable but necessary. But the final episodes of the first season carry a slightly more contained, self-sufficient feeling than the later series precisely because they were written as potential endings. Episodes that might have been goodbyes. Brock, the rock-type gym leader who becomes Ash's traveling companion, was not designed to be a permanent cast member. The original concept for the anime involved rotating companions. The show would follow Ash as he met different gym leaders and trainers, spending time with each before moving on, using the changing companions to showcase different parts of the world. Brock's chemistry with the cast was so strong in early episodes that the rotating companion concept was abandoned. He stayed. The formula of Ash with two main traveling partners, which persisted through most of the show's run, emerged from the discovery that this specific combination, the determined protagonist, the knowledgeable older companion, the energetic peer, worked in a way that could not simply be replaced. Charizard's story in the anime was originally shorter. The plan in early production was for Ash to evolve Charmander into Charmeleon, and then Charizard and then part ways with the Pokemon after it became disobedient. A storyline that would have used the disobedience arc as a reason to let the character go. The overwhelming popularity of Charizard with the audience changed the writer's plans. The disobedience arc extended, deepened, and eventually resolved into one of the show's most significant character arcs. Charizard's moment of choosing loyalty over defiance, in the episode where Ash warms him through the night to keep him from freezing, became one of the most memorable scenes in the anime's history. It was not in the original plan, it was improvised in response to how much viewers cared about a specific fire dragon. The concept for Pokemon Gold and Silver nearly lost one of its most defining features. The day and night cycle, the real-time clock that made the Johto games feel genuinely alive, where different Pokemon appeared at different times, where events changed depending on when you played, was almost cut during development. The Game Boy Color's memory constraints made it technically difficult to store multiple color palettes for each map location. The development team debated making the day-night cycle optional or cutting it entirely to free up the memory for other features. They kept it, and it became one of the foundational elements of the game. An innovation that influenced the design of later franchises like Animal Crossing, which built entire experiences around the concept of games that lived in real time. If the memory pressure had pushed the decision the other way, an entire design philosophy in gaming might have developed differently. There is one more near miss worth sitting with, and it is the strangest one. In the original Pokemon Red and Blue, there is a move called the Trainer Fly glitch. A sequence of actions involving a move like fly or teleport, timed precisely in relation to a trainer spotting you, that corrupts the game's encounter data in a specific way. When performed correctly and followed by triggering a wild Pokemon encounter in certain locations, this glitch produces a wild Mew encounter. Mew is genuinely in the game, as Morimoto put it there. But the glitch route to finding it was not intentional. It is a consequence of how the game stores encounter data and memory, colliding with the specific way Mew's data exists in a slot it was never supposed to occupy. The trainer fly glitch became legendary in the 1990s playground information economy. Children shared the steps like a secret they had received from someone who had heard it, from someone who had actually done it. The steps are specific enough and counterintuitive enough that passing them accurately through the telephone game of schoolyard rumors was difficult. But enough people followed them correctly that the encounter became documented, shared, and eventually understood. Mew's presence in the game, Morimoto's prank, became the center of an actual folklore economy. A network of children passing partial truths and embellishments to each other, trying to triangulate the steps to something real that most of them never managed to reach. The franchise's current worth, as the highest grossing media property in history, exceeding the lifetime earnings of Star Wars, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and every Harry Potter property combined, was built on a foundation of near disasters and accidents and quiet personal acts of creation. A programmer who broke a rule, a decision to change a mascot's color, a television executive who would not let a boy win too soon, a developer who kept an atmospheric music track that a localization team thought was too harsh. The Pokemon anime almost gave Ash's rival Gary Oak a significantly different trajectory after the Indigo League. Early production notes suggest Gary was considered as a co-protagonist for the second season. Traveling with Ash through the Orange Islands arc, the two rivals gradually becoming something closer to allies. This concept was set aside in favor of keeping Gary as a more distant figure who appeared occasionally. And Gary's eventual career path as a Pokemon researcher felt like it emerged somewhat organically from the writer's sense of the character, rather than from a deliberate long-term plan. The version of Gary who appears in the Johto arc, still confident, still a rival, but quieter and more purposeful, carries the traces of a character development that was designed somewhat on the fly in response to where the story needed to go. Team Rocket's longevity in the anime deserves its own accounting. Jesse, James, and Meowth appeared in essentially every episode of the original run, and their presence was, by late in the original series, no longer a creative choice so much as a structural assumption. The writers themselves have described keeping Team Rocket in episodes as having become the easiest solution to pacing problems. If an episode needed a conflict, Team Rocket could provide one reliably without requiring the setup that a new antagonist would need. The trio became a narrative utility and then an institution, and then a cultural touchstone that outlived the creative need for them and became something greater than their original function. Meowth's origin in the anime, the episode detailing how he learned to speak by watching human entertainers and practicing for months, is one of the stranger pieces of character biography in children's animation. A Pokemon who taught itself human language out of an unrequited desire for belonging, who climbed a fire escape to watch a girl dance through a lit window, who spent weeks alone in the dark teaching his tongue the shape of words. The voice actress Inuko Inuyama, who voiced Meowth in the original Japanese run, apparently improvised significant elements of his verbal delivery and personality. The streetwise, slightly melancholy quality of Meowth's speech was not scripted in the way most animated characters' dialogue is scripted. It emerged from a performer finding a voice for character, and the writers recognizing what they had found and writing toward it. In the Game Boy Color era, the development of Pokemon Gold and Silver pushed the hardware to its absolute limits in ways that produced unexpected problems. The real-time clock system, the one that drove the day-night cycle, the weekly events, the days of the week that determined which bug-catching contest was running, required the game to maintain an internal clock even when the cartridge was not being played. This was achieved through a separate circuit with its own battery, distinct from the save battery. The clock battery was rated to last approximately 10 years. The implications of this were not apparent in 1999. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, original gold and silver cartridges were beginning to have their clock batteries die. When the clock battery died, berries stopped growing. The bug-catching contest stopped running. The Pokemon that only appeared during specific times of day stopped appearing. The day-night cycle, the centerpiece of the game's entire design, the thing that made Johto feel like a living world, froze. Players who picked up old cartridges and noticed the world had gone flat often thought their cartridge was damaged. It was not damaged. It was just out of time, literally. The community of Pokemon fans eventually developed methods for replacing the clock batteries in Generation 2 cartridges, extending the lives of the game's real-time systems. Small tutorials spread online. A generation of players who are now adults learned basic electronics repair to bring their old games back to a living state. The day-night cycle, preserved across 2 decades by people willing to open a cartridge with a small screwdriver and solder in a replacement battery, is still running in thousands of original cartridges today. The Pokemon franchise generating more revenue than any other media property in recorded history. A total that, at last count, exceeded $150 billion across all categories. Was not a destination that anyone planned for. It was not a destination that seemed possible when a team of exhausted developers was working for free in 1995, or when a network executive thought the show might not make it past the first season, or when a programmer squeezed 300 bytes out of a Game Boy cartridge and filled them with a small pink creature he designed himself in 2 weeks. The franchise exists because of accumulated accidents. Because of a man who lost his insect collecting fields to urban expansion and spent 6 years and nearly his last dollar building a world where nobody would ever have to lose that feeling. Because of a programmer who broke protocol and hid something nobody was supposed to find. Because of a marketer who chose yellow over pink. Because of a producer who would not let a boy win too soon. None of it was inevitable. All of it happened. And all the secrets, the hidden Pokemon, the banned episodes, the creepy pastas, the beta designs, the glitches and the ghosts, are just the surface evidence of all the small human decisions that accumulated into something enormous. There is a quality that the best Pokemon secrets share. They are not secrets in the way that hidden passages in adventure novels are secrets. Not dramatic, not designed to be discovered, not rewarding in an obvious way. They are more like the secrets that exist in everything that is made by people who care deeply about what they are making. The detail that only a few people will ever notice. The joke that only makes sense if you have specific knowledge. The tribute that is invisible unless you know who it is for. Game Freak has been embedding these things into their games for nearly 3 decades, and the total weight of them, all the hidden humor, all the deliberate obscurity, all the things that were left in the code when they could have been removed, adds up to a portrait of people who love what they are doing and do it with an attention that exceeds what anyone could reasonably require of them. That is what hidden things and loved things always mean. They mean someone cared enough to put this here, knowing almost nobody would find it, because the act of putting it here was its own reward. Satoshi Tajiri cared enough to build an entire world from a childhood that the city had erased. Shigeki Morimoto cared enough to hide a small pink creature in 300 bytes of borrowed space. The animator who programmed Meowth's idle animation to have him tap his paw occasionally in a specific rhythm cared enough to do it when nobody was requiring that level of detail. All of it is still there, waiting in the code, waiting in the tall grass. You have been with this video for a long time now. The world outside your window is whatever it is, mama. Maybe dark, maybe quiet, maybe the middle of the night, or the slow end of a long day. Whether you fell asleep 30 minutes in and just woke up to the sound of the outro, or you stayed for every single word, either way, I am glad you were here. There is one more thing worth saying before the end. Something that threads through all of these stories without ever being stated directly. The people who made Pokemon were not, for the most part, thinking about legacy. They were thinking about deadlines and memory constraints, and whether the battery would hold the save data, and whether the animation frame would fit on the cartridge, and whether the localization team had made the right call. They were thinking about practical problems in real time. The things that turned out to matter. The day-night cycle, the friendship mechanic, the decision to faint instead of die, the decision to hide something in 300 bytes just because there was room. Those things mattered because people cared about them as craft problems, not because anyone could see what they would eventually become. This is the actual history of almost every piece of culture that lasts. It is not made by people who know they are making something eternal. It is made by people solving the immediate problem in front of them with whatever skill and care they can bring to it, in the hope that it will be good enough. The things that endure do so because the care went into the details, as well as the whole. Because someone who did not have to think carefully about how a ghost Pokemon would carry its own face through eternity, did think carefully about it, and put that thought into text that millions of children would eventually read. The franchise holds all of its secrets the way anything genuinely loved holds the evidence of the people who loved it. Carefully, without making a fuss about it, waiting for you to look closely enough to find them. That is all of it. Every hidden fact I could find, from the very first beetle Satoshi Tajiri ever caught in a rice paddy in Machida, to the developer who left a secret congratulatory message buried 65,000 slot machine pulls deep in a cartridge nobody would ever reach. Every secret in the tall grass. Rest well. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. It is a small thing that means a lot to a channel like this one. Drop a comment with where in the world you are watching from and which fact from this whole video stayed with you the longest. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know. There are people in this comment section from every time zone on the planet, watching this in the dark at 2 in the morning, or falling asleep with their headphones in on a long commute, and knowing where all of you are is one of the best parts of doing this. Until next time, sleep well, and wherever you are tonight, whether it is raining or quiet, or the fan is running in the background and you can hear the occasional car passing outside on a wet road, or the house is completely still and the only sound is your own breathing, I hope this found you at the right moment, at exactly the right time, on exactly the right night to hear all of it.